Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 6th chapter in the book of Micah, and what we witness Micah do in the 5th and 6th chapters, respectively, is do the prophet's design function, which was to give promises and issue warnings. So in the 6th chapter, he lays out Yahweh's case against the wayward nation of Israel. Then he pronounces judgment and the guilt of Judah. So a lot of these prophets, they were Judean or Israelite by background, and they prophesied to each other. So there was two covenant nations, but one covenant people, and the covenant nation to the north was more idolatrous and wicked than the covenant nation to the south, Judah. So they met their end a little before Judah would, but the warning and the example was literally above them and right next to them, yet somehow they were stubborn and going their own way, so Yahweh would send prophets to correct the people, to stimulate them on the covenant path and be blessed or be cursed. So he does issue the warnings. Now his wrath is always just, and his punishment is always righteous, because he never ever resorts to punishment without warning. So he sends his prophets to warn, and it is upon us to take the warning seriously. And I earlier mentioned that the 5th chapter is promise-oriented, whereas the 6th is oriented. And one of the most magnificent promises of the 5th is in the 2nd verse, 2nd through 4th, where he predicts that the Messiah will be born of Bethlehem. That's the town of David's birth town. And he's going to be the ruler of all Israel. His comings are forth from old, from everlasting. That means he is eternal, he is divine. So the Jews kind of envisioned, or at least by the New Testament, and probably after and in between, they envisioned the Messiah as a man, a military man who would restore them. They struggled to accept what seems to them a discrepancy in their monotheistic integrity. The Trinity distorts their whole conception of that. But he shall stand and be shepherd in the strength of Yahweh, in the excellency of the name of Yahweh. The Son clarifies throughout the New Testament that he is sent of Yahweh, he is his beloved, he is his father. He refers to him as my father. So his authority and his power and his mission are all derived from the Father, and he is closely connected to him. And then the 7th verse, we read that a remnant of Jacob, that's Israel, shall be in the midst of many people. So they were a nation now, but after the diaspora, after the scattering, they would have to establish their identities in nations that were not exclusively comprised of their own people. 8th verse, and the remnant of Jacob shall be among the Gentiles in the midst of many peoples. So that says much of what the 7th verse says. Then in the 13th verse, this kind of transitions and sets the tone for the warning, emphasis of which comes in the 6th chapter. I shall cut off your carved images. Those are idols. Those are forbidden physical edifices which worship rival deities. Israel should have known better. Sadly, the temptation was always palpable for them to succumb to the practices and detestable abominations of their neighbors, which were all around them, and some of their influence crept in, inviting judgment. So it was idolatry above all else that merited these warnings which come. And I shall destroy your cities. So that's just the covenantal curses for if you persist in idolatry. And I shall take vengeance and wrath and rage on the Gentiles who did not obey. So the Gentiles, once they are given the path to salvation by grace through faith, they which literally comes in the New Testament. This is a future-oriented prophecy and warning that they would not be absolved of the need to obey. So there is no cheap grace, and there is no insincere faith which accomplishes our salvation. Opening verse of the 6th chapter, hear now what Yahweh is saying. Arise, strive with the mountains, and let the hills be your voice. This message comes from Yahweh, and we have to hear it and take it seriously with gravity and volume, because the one who's speaking it is Yahweh himself. Micah is his scribe of sorts, so his words are not strictly speaking his own. And what Yahweh is telling us by telling him is that all of creation is going to witness and be witness to his voice. And so the mountains was a symbol of eternality, even though they weren't literally eternal. They were symbolically representative of the eternal one. Hear, O you mountains, the controversy of Yahweh, and you everlasting foundations of the earth. For Yahweh has a controversy with his people, and he shall reprove Israel. So the controversy was covenantal related. They weren't following the covenant. They were not taking it seriously, and he was calling the mountains and all creation to witness against him. Foundations of the earth, that means everything in it, every item in nature, every element of weather, every physical reality of the earth shall witness, and he's going to reprove Israel for having the whole for initiating the whole controversy with the covenant. Now the covenant is controversial because there are blessings and there are curses. My people, what have I done to you, and how have I wearied you? Answer me. So he has a question and he demands an answer. He's asking them, what have I ever done to you to make you treat me this way? Why are you forsaking me to the extent that you are? You are my people. You belong to me. I belong to you. You are not using me or engaging me in an active, living, dynamic relationship. So that's not an easy question to answer. And he reminds them much of their history, which really gives them no excuse for not loving him and living loyally to him. For I brought you out of the land of Egypt, and I ransomed you from the house of bondage, and I sent Moses, Aaron, and Miriam before you. This is a reminder of their history in the Exodus generation. They were a nation enslaved in another nation, but they were liberated through redeemed from slavery, and a redeemed people demands ethical obligations. We are not redeemed from slavery to succumb to the slavery of self with our freedom, which we pervert into license. And Moses, Aaron, and Miriam were the prophetic siblings. Aaron was the high priest. Moses was the lawgiver. Miriam was a prophetess who wrote the Song of Yahweh, amongst other things. But these were the three siblings of the human liberators of Israel, who wielded words and wonders through them. My people, remember please what Balak, king of Moab, counseled, and what Balaam, son of Beor, answered him from Shittim to Gilgal, in order to know the righteousness of Elohim. So Balak and Balaam are characters we meet in the book of Numbers. We can read their stories in chapters 22 through 25. Balak is the king of Moab, who is threatened by this nation on the march. The book of Numbers, we witness the nation of Israel on the march, and Moab was one of the descendants of the incestuous liaison between Lot and one of his daughters. They were a nation of people, and he hired a Mesopotamian soothsayer by the name of Balaam for money. He was motivated by money, but he had an unexpected literal encounter with Yahweh and angels, and he could not resist the message he was sent. So there was much truth expressed in the prophecies of this soothsayer, which was an illicit, forbidden practice. Nevertheless, Yahweh used him to express his will. And that his will is to know the righteousness of Yahweh. He wills that we live good lives, we live righteously. That's going to come into the 6th and 8th verse. Verse 6. Okay, yeah. With what shall I come before Yahweh, bow myself before the high Elohim? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings and calves a year old? So this seizes, the quotation marks cease. So that was Yahweh talking through his prophet earlier, beginning with the word arise in the first verse. Now the quotation marks cease. So this is Micah speaking, and he's asking some questions, and these are questions worthy of all consideration. What must we do? How must we walk to walk and abide in the grace of God? And so he asked the first questions: are sacrifices, animal sacrifices, burnt sacrifices with calves a year old, would this make me worthy before him? And in the trajectory which follows, it goes increasingly more severe and more extreme in what the measure of human life one is supposed to sacrifice. Is Yahweh pleased with 1,000 of rams or 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my being? So no amount of number of animal sacrifices or rivers of oil or anything else can satisfy him. What he's satisfied is the faith which the sacrifice was made. So a sacrifice offered apart from obedience is essentially worthless and meaningless to heaven. But when we do it in the right spirit, with the right attitude, then it is a sweet-smelling aroma. Now we witness the firstborn. Yahweh himself was willing to kill his firstborn for the sacrifice of all the sins of all the world, of all the ages, past, present, future, all time, everyone. But we also witness Abraham was called to do something similar with his son Isaac, and just the fact that he was willing to do it was a sweet-smelling aroma. He didn't actually put the knife. He had Isaac tied up. He was ready to go, but then the angel intervened and sent a ram in his stead. But even if one were to sacrifice one's own body, that would not be enough. What is enough? This proceeds from the negative, the evidently obvious answers to the rhetorical questions that sacrifices of animals cannot be pleasing and acceptable, at least not in themselves, to the one to whom they are offered. He has declared to you, O man, what is good, and what does Yahweh require of you, but to do right, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your Elohim. So they already know, they have already been told, they have already been instructed and educated through the covenant and the law and the prophets and the writings to know what is good and what Yahweh, because it's what he deems good, and he alone is good absolutely, intrinsically, in the fullest sense, and it would have been a blasphemous term to call any man good, yet we are required to emulate his goodness in whatever limited ways we can, but his definition of good must define the good acts we do. And what does he really want? What does he require of you is not animal sacrifices, but positive, life-changing, society-transforming virtues. Now, the prophets we don't only read them, they weren't merely concerned with theological doctrine. Social justice was a major part of their message. So the rich in the covenant nation were constantly ripping off, abusing, exploiting the poor. The prophets reminded them of the equalizing elements of the Mosaic law. So to do right in order for a society to function and to love with kindness, kindness falls onto the umbrella of love. So we are to love kindness and love being it, love being around it. And how else will one walk before Elohim but humbly? So that's almost a rhetorical or redundant statement. There's no other way one can walk with Elohim but that way, because no sinner can tarry in his presence, and humility is a virtue, pride is the sin. The voice of Yahweh cries to the city, and let sound wisdom see your name. Hear the rod of him who appointed it. So this stage of the narrative marks a distinct literary transition. Earlier he is speaking to Israel. Now he's turning the tides on Judah, Jerusalem, his own people. So let sound wisdom see your name, hear the rod of him who appointed it. So the rod is the branch of Jesse, so that's also one way of looking at it. But the wisdom is intrinsically connected to his name. The contemplation of the name itself is a wisdom-building exercise. The voice of Yahweh cries to the city, and let the sound wisdom see your name. Hear the rod and him who appointed it. I actually just read that. Are there still treasures of wickedness in the house of the wicked, and the short measure that is an abomination? So earlier I mentioned that the rich, the prosperous in Israel had a disconcerting habit to take their treasures at the expense of the poor, and this was ill-gotten and therefore wicked treasure. Now, wealth in itself is not sinful, but the ways one can acquire that wealth or treat it and be possessed by it can be sinful. So wealth is dangerous territory, and if ill-gotten wealth or being possessed by your possessions, you will forfeit the kingdom, and the dishonest measurements, the misleading measurements, is an abomination to Yahweh because it's a way of ripping people off by giving them short of the measurement that you say. So this practice was common, even though it was forbidden in Israel. It was common nevertheless. Would I be innocent with wicked scales and with the bag of false weights? Of course not. What Yahweh declares an abomination means that one cannot be declared innocent or justified if one practices in that which Yahweh deems an abomination. For her rich men are filled with cruel unrighteousness, and her inhabitants have spoken falsehood, and their tongue is deceit in their mouth. Now, it almost seems impossible that any act of unrighteousness cannot be cruel, but it might be possible to do unrighteousness apart from cruelty, but that takes us into a speculative direction that we didn't prepare for. But lies and deceit and falsehood, dishonest society can neither function nor flourish because truth and honesty is the glue which holds us all together. So I shall smite you with a grievous wound, to lay you waste because of your sin. Now, why would a loving Elohim smite one of his own, one of his chosen people, with affliction or a grievous wound? And the answer is because of its sin. A loving God cannot overlook a single sin, but it's still part of his mercy can be part of his justice. We shouldn't protest or complain or question the reason why Yahweh ever resorts to wrath. When we familiarize ourselves with this book from start to finish and everywhere in between, we will know that Yahweh is incapable of acting unrighteously. So whenever he resorts to wrath, ergo by definition, it is righteous. You shall eat but not be satisfied, and your inside be empty, and you shall store up but not save, and what you save I shall give to the sword. So it's all for nothing, all their physical needs and immediate gratifications they're going to eat, but it's not going to be enough. They're not going to be satisfied by eating because life consists of more than bread and food. And it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of Yahweh. So to seek satisfaction in food or anything else in the end is a vanity exercise because you're going to turn out empty when it's all said and done. And everything you invest will not be saved. It will pay no dividends. You thought you were saving it, but it's going to the marauding raiders who are going to ransack the land of city of Jerusalem and land of Judah as a consequence for their sins, of which they have been warned, in which they are without excuse for not acting on the better knowledge, which they had no reason or right to ignore. You shall sow, but not reap. You shall tread the olives, but not anoint yourself with oil, and make sweet wine, but not drink with wine. So they can plant all the seeds in the ground. Nothing's going to sprout out. Nothing's going to come up. They will reap without sow without reaping. I always get those confused. So to sow is to plant, but reaping is to get up. So they're going to plant, but nothing's going to spring out of the ground. And, all the effort and energy they expend in the direction of olive and olive oil and wine is it's all going to be for naught because they're not even going to get to test what they expended their efforts and energies toward the making of. So they made these because they thought they would find satisfaction. They're not going to find satisfaction, lasting, eternal satisfaction in any source apart from Yahweh and Elohim more broadly. Final verse 16. For the laws of Omri are strictly observed, in all the works of the house of Ahab, and you walk in their counsels. Therefore I give you a ruin, and your inhabitants for a hissing, and let you bear the reproach of my people. So there are two significant kings in the northern kingdom of Israel's history. Omri was the one who elevated the hill of Samir. He purchased a hill which was strategically fortified geographically, and he elevated it to the capital city of Israel. And like every king of Israel, he was wicked, but we read that his wickedness was to a degree unprecedented. So every single king who reigned on the throne of Israel was invariably an idolater, and Ahab was perhaps the worst of the worst, though his wife usually is a more reviled creature, Jezebel. He was very much his wife's creature, but he was still a weak man who allowed her to kill the prophets, the true prophets in her midst. And but they're given a room because they reap what they sow. Even when they sow but don't reap, they reap what they sow. Agriculturally, they do reap what they sow spiritually, and so they're they're determined to be on the destination of ruin and devastation, and the inhabitants will be a proverb and a byword, and you're going to have to bear the reproach of my people as the just consequences for your sin. So everything that Yahweh does, once more we want to reiterate, is always and only just and righteous, and we are commanded to reflect his attributes, because as a child mimics his father, if we call him his heavenly father, we have to be like he is. So we are to cultivate everything it says in verse 8: do right, love kindness, walk humbly. These are the duties of the Jew and the Christian. So I hope that's the reason you're here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.